Thanks, Penny. And sorry again that I couldn't be there. Would have loved to have been there. Good morning to you all. Hope you had a good breakfast and a good start to the day. So I'm going to do a screen share with you. I'll make available a lot of the stuff and the links that I talk about in the Resource Hub. So I plan on doing a quick kind of outline of the context in which we do our work, a little session or a section on what is a B Corp to try and explain that to you. And then we'll end with a little exercise and a chance for some questions. So I often do start this conversation with a bit of an outline of some of the challenges facing us, but I think the travel sector is more than familiar enough with some of the challenges facing it in the last year. I'm in awe of the travel businesses that I know that have had to really reinvent themselves multiple times over and continue to do so. So instead of doing that, I'm going to jump straight to my friend Milton Friedman. Milton wrote an essay in the New York Times in 1970, so 50 years ago last September, commonly called The Doctrine of Shareholder Primacy. It's really captured by a statement that you might have heard versions of before, which is the idea that the one and only social responsibility of business is to use its resources to increase its profits, or in other words, to provide returns to shareholders. In the B-Lab world, we call this the source code error in modern capitalism. We think it's been largely used and abused for the last 50 years, and it still does amazingly remain quite relevant and certainly controversial. But it's a bit like politicians who retire and develop nuanced views and empathy and a wider perspective. So we see many business leaders look back on their careers and recognise just how limiting the idea of only focusing on shareholder returns was, and how unrealistic or just plain wrong it is. And basically just gets rolled out when a company needs to justify an action that has led to terrible consequences for someone else. We all know this to be true in the sense that none of us leap out of bed to drive shareholder returns. Even most founders of businesses, that's not what motivates them. People seek fulfillment, well-being, and of course an income. And they also generally work to have an impact. In the travel sector, so often that's captured by the idea of making people happy and showing them new places. So for me, the Friedman doctrine is a great place to start because it's really at the core of our work in seeking to change the system that we're working in. A lot of numbers on this screen, but I just want to focus on a couple. I guess the headline here is quite straightforward. It's not just one group of people. In fact, we see consumers, investors, business leaders, and employees all looking for businesses to have a clearer orientation to purpose. 86% of customers expect CEOs to publicly speak out about societal challenges, and 68% believe CEOs should step in when government does not fix societal problems. We've seen one of the biggest government interventions in our economy in the last year since World War II, and I think it's been really fascinating to see that the expectations of business have only increased in this time to be part of a solution and certainly not contributing to the problems. The phrase ESG is one that you might hear as well, which is environment, social and governance, and ESG frameworks are increasingly being seen as a key thing for a business to have, and that's exactly where the B Corp certification fits in. Also want to touch on these couple of numbers. I love the Edelman Trust Barometer, and if you're not onto it, it's a great read. The work that they do is really fascinating. But they found in 2020 that 91% of Australians believe that stakeholders, not shareholders, are most important for the long-term success of a business, and that 70% of Australians believe that a company can take action to both increase profits and improve conditions in the communities where it operates. We talk a lot about the idea of balancing purpose and profits, and I'm trying to do a lot less of that now because of the fact that we don't actually see it as a balancing exercise. We see profit increasingly as a key enabler, purpose as a key enabler of profit. And the more your business is oriented to have a positive impact, the more it can actually drive your profits. I did want to also touch on these numbers, and I'll stop talking numbers in a moment, but I love this one. This is a piece of work done by McKinsey in 2019, looking at employees and managers in US companies. It's a couple of years old, but it makes a really important point. They found that 82% of people in business felt it's important that their business should have a purpose. 72% felt that their purpose should receive more weight than profit, but only 62% said their organisation actually has a purpose statement, and fascinatingly, only 42% felt that their organisation's purpose statement actually drives impact. And there's a really important lesson in this. It's not enough to simply change a purpose, a company vision to include an element of purpose. you need to bring it to life. And again, that's where frameworks and practices really come to the fore. So that links to what we do. So B-Lab itself was found or established in 2007 in the US with a not-for-profit organisation behind B Corp certification. And we support a global movement of people using business as a force for good. B-Lab Australia and Aotearoa New Zealand started in 2013. Our international network of organisation leads economic systems change work to support our collective vision of an inclusive, equitable and regenerative economy. So we're building the B Corp movement to change our economic system. And to do that, we really have to change the rules of the game. But we're not really just focused on changing literally the legislation and regulations that govern business. We create standards, policies, tools, and programs that shift the behaviour, culture, and structure of capitalism. We're working within the capitalist system, which we believe in. And our primary work is in certifying companies known as B Corps, who are really leading the way and setting new standards for social and environmental performance. We also then work to mobilise the B Corp community towards collective action to address some of society's most critical challenges. And today, if you get a chance, make sure you hear from Susanna at Intrepid Group, who are a brilliant example of that with such a strong commitment to reducing emissions from travel, amongst other things. So certified B corporations or B Corps, you hear that phrase as well. They're companies that are verified by us to meet very high standards of social and environmental performance, transparency and accountability. There are, I think, just on 4,000, I think this week in the world, almost 350 in our region. They're across multiple industries and they come in all sizes and shapes. That includes single person consultancies right up to global multinationals. So it's an incredibly diverse group of businesses. To touch on a little bit of, well, how do you actually get certified? There are three key elements. The idea of accountability is really created through requiring B Corps to adopt a legal framework. To become a B Corp, you need to adopt into your company constitution or whatever the equivalent document is for different legal structures, a commitment to achieve an overall public benefit purpose whilst generating shareholder returns, and to consider all stakeholders in your highest level decision-making. And really what that means is by embedding something into a constitution, it's embedding it into the agreement between your shareholders, your directors and your management. Appreciate in small businesses, sometimes that's the same person, but it's really important to still embed that, particularly if a company is set to grow, to make sure that that founding principle is locked in place right from the start. The second element is our B Impact Assessment, which is a free online platform that any business can use. It's structured like a sort of like a survey. You have to answer a whole bunch of questions and you end up getting a score. You earn points for how well you're aligned to our standards, and there are different versions of the assessment depending on the industry or geography or size of your business. Last count, I think there's about 85 different tracks, and you automatically get put down a track depending how you answer some initial questions. I'll come back to that in one moment. The last element is what we call our B Impact Report, which is our global directory of B Corps, where your score, your performance is made transparent for anyone to come and have a look at. And you can head to our website, look at the directory and see how different B Corps perform. And I'll show you a couple of examples on that in just a moment. So to just unpack a little bit more the impact assessment platform, there are 5 main categories. And this is a key concept for today. The B Corp assessment is holistic. It looks at all aspects of a business. It doesn't just look at a product or a particular practice. What makes B Corp unique is the fact that it looks across the entirety of a business's operations and business model. So the first section is governance. It asks questions designed to explore how a company operates and how its ethics are embedded, how its accountability and transparency mechanisms are built. It looks at workers, which is quite often a very deep dive into people and culture, policies and practices. And it's designed to really explore how a business is designed to improve the welfare of its employees. Community is probably the broadest sector. It looks at all aspects of community, from issues like charitable giving or local economic development, how much you're supporting other local businesses, but also dives very deep into a business's supply chain to see how it works with partners all the way through its supply chain. Probably the most challenging area for businesses, particularly in manufacturing or with complex global supply chains. Environment, fairly self-explanatory, looks at a business's environmental footprint, and customers really looks at the business model. So this looks at and rewards businesses for having business models that are designed to create specific impact. So it may be, for instance, that a particular business has a program where they go into Indigenous community to provide education, or they provide a particular product to people who are in need. That kind of aspect is rewarded under the customers section. So it looks at the business model itself. So those 5 head categories cover close to a couple of hundred questions. It's a very deep dive. It takes a long time to complete. And the guidance we usually give is to form a bit of a project team to tackle it, making sure that relatively senior people in the business are answering these questions. Don't give it to the summer intern. You'll end up with a score of 180 that'll never stack up. You need to give it to people that have a really good, accurate understanding of the business. So to bring that to life, I just want to touch on a couple of real life examples, and I picked them outside the travel sector. One great example is Aspen Medical. They're a leading global healthcare solutions provider based in Canberra. They're Australian owned, and they've had an enormous growth in the last few years, obviously last year in particular. What makes them different is the very services that they provide. So they deploy medical services on short notice, often in crisis situations, dealing with vulnerable people. And that means that their business model is really articulated to have a positive impact. They also happen to have really brilliant office practices, including my favorite thing, which is they have office chickens in their head office in Canberra, real chickens that eat the scraps. I just love that idea for a very large, complex global business. And if you were to go to their assessment, you can see their score, and you can see here that they outperform in the customers section, because that's where their business model is really oriented towards impact, and they have an overall score of 90 points out of the 200. I should stress that achieving 80 points is a very high benchmark. Most businesses land in the 50 to 60 point range and then have to work hard to improve to get to that 80 points. Different example is Latrobe Valley Bus Lines, started by the wonderful Rhonda Renwick down in the Latrobe Valley in Gippsland in Victoria. It's a very different example. The bus company focuses enormously on its environmental impact, and they've led the industry in terms of capturing solar energy and rolling out electric buses. But they also have some brilliant policies designed to really look after the well-being of their workforce. And they have incredibly strong community giving practices that are baked into the business. If you go to their assessment, you would see that they perform really well in the community sector section. A great example is during the lockdown last year in Victoria, they recognised that a lot of people were riding their buses to really access some sort of social connectivity. And this created a bit of stress for their drivers who were driving at a time where community concern about the virus was very high and perhaps not as well understood as it is now. But they turned that into really creating programs with local government to try and make sure that they could look after the people who were riding their buses as well as their bus drivers. And they connected their drivers to the idea of the social service that they were providing. They're a brilliantly run business and very inspiring. Their total score is 94.3, but the numbers are always tempting to make a comparison. The reality is that every B Corp is different, and the way it builds up to that score is different. So we don't necessarily always just compare on the numbers. It's important to understand what makes a particular business special. So I'm painting a picture, I hope, of a very challenging assessment process and a very difficult certification to achieve. Our approach is to only certify the highest performing businesses to shine a light on them. So why would you bother doing this? And there's a bunch of what we call sort of traditional value drivers of any certification. You get a certification to build trust, credibility, and brand value. It's about showing why your business is different and that that's been certified by a third party to show what's actually different about it. But that also works internally. It's a really important stakeholder group is employees to show credibility in the business and the processes behind it. For a lot of B Corps, it's about building a global movement and creating change and combating short-termism, which we know is a huge issue in listed companies particularly. Alan Joyce at Qantas has a lot to say on lots of interesting issues. It's an incredibly important business for us as a country, but when they release their quarterly results, there's only one thing that the media wants to talk about, and that's those short-term financial numbers. And I think that there's a big aspect of joining the B Corp community to try and reorient that conversation to much more long-term considerations. Humans are a tribal crew. We like to find our tribe, and that's certainly an aspect of the B Corp community. B Corps work a lot together. They often create initiatives together, and there's a lot of collaboration across the community. The fifth benefit is around increasing employee engagement, attracting talent and retention. And this is a huge value driver for a lot of our professional services firms, but increasingly anyone in the B Corp community who employs people will lead with their certification to help communicate to an increasingly interested workforce what the business is actually all about. And then the last point on this slide is around protecting mission. So founder-led businesses will often be looking for mechanisms to try and ensure that their business, as it grows and attracts new shareholders, holds true to the original mission that the founder had in place. Patagonia globally is a great example of that. They use B Corp certification very pointedly to try and ensure that the principles behind their business are held true as it grows and takes on more shareholders. Then lastly, this one came out of a conversation with Penny yesterday. We certainly see a lot of evidence globally that businesses with good ESG frameworks, whether it's B Corp or something else, are increasingly seen as more resilient and more attractive to investors. Kathmandu in New Zealand, a B Corp as well, just secured a $100 million sustainability-linked loan with ANZ Bank, where they actually get reduced or more favourable credit terms as they achieve their sustainability goals. And the banks and investors aren't doing this just to be nice. They're doing this because they're recognising a business with a really robust ESG framework is more resilient through crises. And we're seeing good evidence of this as well in the B Corp community last year. But I think this applies equally to SMEs. One of the classic challenges of an SME is when to find the time and space to document process and practice. I've run small businesses and failed spectacularly in this respect myself. It is really important, though, when you're facing a crisis, to have process to fall back on, and a good ESG framework in a small business is just as relevant as it is in a very large business, albeit accepting the fact that it's often more challenging in a small business to find the resources to get through it. So I want to call out Intrepid Group again and just make reference to a really brilliant case study that was released with the World Travel and Tourism Council just last month. It's a really deep dive into understanding what Intrepid Group is about and why they sought out B Corp certification. So if you're interested, really encourage you to track that down and have a read. And then just to illustrate some brands that you might recognise in the Australia and New Zealand community of B Corps. It's 350 B Corps almost strong. Lots of them are B2B small enterprises, but we've also got some higher profile businesses that we tend to talk about to try and get more attention. And there's a sample of them on the screen there. So just before I wrap up, I want to give you something that you might do at some stage today if you're sitting down with a cup of coffee and you've got a spare few minutes. This is taken from Tim Duggan's book, Cult Status, which I'll show you in a minute, but highly recommend the read. It's a great, really practical book that gives you some tips on how to make what he calls a cult brand in the modern economy. This particular chapter is about really starting off with your vision statement or your purpose statement. And it's a great exercise in turning that from what is often a fairly self-centered statement to one that really focuses on the impact that you want to have. And he does it very simply by simply writing down in your own words what you think your business is all about, what you're trying to achieve, and adding the words "so that" to the end of that sentence, and continuing to do that until you come up with a meaningful impact that you can then measure and really focus on and bring people around you to join in that mission. And I think that that's a key concept, that an effective mission statement is one that attracts people even outside your business to join. A good example of that is Nexpa. Now, they're not actually a B Corp, but they're an example that Tim uses in his book. Their mission statement was to tackle diabetes, obesity, and gut health through naturally sugar-free innovations. They developed some sugar-free soft drinks. And by following this exercise through, they developed an impact statement so that we remove tons of sugar and artificial consumption from the world's diet. Now, that's still a very high aspirational statement, but the crucial thing, it gives them something to focus on beyond just selling more soft drink. They're actually looking to remove sugar and artificial consumption. So it gives them a frame of reference and something to measure and focus on outside the growth and success of their own business. And I think that's a really good example of an effective impact statement. So to wrap up, encourage you to head to our website if you want to dive a little deeper. There's a short course from Torrens University, another B Corp, on our website that is a great way to really understand a bit more about the certification. And then finally, some reading for you if you're interested in diving a little deeper. You can see Tim's book, Cult Status, there. Tim's from Sydney. And then the one that's really inspired me most in the last year is Simon Sinek's The Infinite Game. It's a really fascinating read about the future of business. So that's enough of me talking. Happy to take any questions with anyone who's got any. Penny, back to you.
Thanks, Andrew. We did have a few people in here, but they've slid off to go to their next appointments. But we do have a couple of people left. Do you have any questions for Andrew?
Pressure on the small audience to come up with questions.
Pressure on the small audience. Listen, that was brilliant. I know you and I talked about this yesterday, and just for clarity, I think it's really important to understand who sets the measures, the targets, and how frequently that is updated. How does that work?
So they're set by a Standards Advisory Council, a global Standards Advisory Council, and they're completely revisited every 3 years. And B Corps have to be recertified every 3 years. So every 3 years, you're effectively sitting a different test. The Standards Advisory Council is also informed by a series of regional advisory groups, and B Corps themselves participate in that as well. So it's a sort of arm's length group from me and my organisation in this region, and they're set really informed as standards evolve over time. So a good example at the moment is there's a lively debate about whether our environmental standards should include or reward commitments to net zero emissions, which 3 or 4 years ago didn't really exist as a thing. And that's creating some debate, because rewarding people who make commitments is not as good as rewarding people who actually take action. So we're looking to make sure that our standards don't just rely on someone who says they're going to reduce emissions, but actually reward a business that is taking steps to reduce their emissions. And that's a really interesting debate unfolding at the moment.
Yeah, I love that idea of building the bridge out so that there's always something next to grow to. Andrew, thank you very much. We will see you again later.
Not at all. Enjoy your day, everyone. And again, sorry I couldn't be there and meet you in person.
Ditto. Thank you.